Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on The Simple Art of Murder by Raymond Chandler, a seminal essay in which Chandler, having written numerous stories, published a couple books, was examining what he really thought was valuable in detective fiction. He was championing a certain aspect of it and lambasting other aspects of it. And it's a short essay. I think plenty of folks have read it. And I want to use this as a window to explore how styles in detective fiction changed and morphed really across the 20th century in the US and in the UK, and just pick out a few of my favorites. And I wanted to have this video up as part of Private Eye July, but we had serious car trouble. Actually, I had to end up getting a new car, but here we are with The Simple Art of Murder. So Chandler in this opens up by pointing out how really great fiction has tended to be realistic. It doesn't have to be, but it has tended to be, and that part of what can feel cumbersome about reading an older book, a period piece, if you will, is that it does not fit our modern style. And he even links realistic fiction to Jane Austen's novels. And then he goes on to start to express certain issues that exist within modern detective novels. And he notes that it's an incredibly popular type of story. As he was writing it, mysteries continue to be incredibly popular today. I think they would be up there with romance novels in terms of what folks are grabbing and reading still. People who there are people who only read mystery novels. And Chandler is recognizing this nearly a century ago. And he notes the comment from Hemingway that the great writers are only competing with the dead. That no, great detective writers are competing with the dead, but also with hundreds of living writers who are just pushing it out all the time. And what is it that allows a really strong detective writer to exist? And he notes that one of the issues is there's a type of detective story that is basically a puzzle. It is a logic puzzle. It is advertised as a logic puzzle. It's a narrative brain teaser where we are meant as readers to go on the journey with the detective, see and hear and sense the exact same clues the detective experiences, and then try to put them together in our mind as the detective is putting them together. And then ultimately all is revealed at the end, and we're able to trace back and be like, oh, that's right, I figured it out, or wait a second, no, I missed this clue, I missed this clue, I missed this clue. And Chandler kind of mocks that. At one point he says, there are much better plots by these same writers and by others of their school. There may be one somewhere that would really stand up under close scrutiny. It would be fun to read it, even if I did have to go back to page 47 and refresh my memory about exactly what time the second gardener potted the prize-winning tea rose begonia. And he notes that people have really championed these and said there's a golden age of detective fiction, and it's this type of story. And I think that's a type of story I loved growing up. There was something about the puzzle within the detective fiction that can be a real delight, especially as someone who gravitated towards math and the logic there. It could be fun to go in and try to follow the logic of the story. But what Chandler notes is that a lot of times it doesn't hold up, and that can be a problem. If the entire purpose of reading the detective story or the detective novel is to trace the route and follow the plot and figure out the puzzle, there's any plot hole suddenly makes the whole thing seem like a house of cards and just crumble. And he notes various examples that various famous critics at the time had said this was the perfect detective story or the greatest detective novel. And he just sort of catalogs what doesn't quite work. But he goes on to note that they don't have to be this way. He goes, there's a very simple statement to be made about all these stories. They do not really come off intellectually as problems, and they do not come off artistically as fiction. They are too contrived, too little aware of what goes on in the world. They try to be honest, but honesty is an art. The poor writer is dishonest without knowing it, and the fairly good one can be dishonest because he doesn't know what to be honest about. He thinks a complicated murder scheme which baffled the lazy reader, who won't be bothered itemizing the details, will also baffle the police, whose business is with details. And he notes that that's one of the real problems, is that if we have a nice little plot that seems just clever enough, would any professional be totally taken in by it? ultimately, one of the writers that Chandler chooses to champion, and he notes that this is one of the few writers that has been championed, is Dashiell Hammett. And he brings the Maltese Falcon in specifically. And this is honestly one of my all-time favorites. I'm sure many of you have read this book and loved it, or seen the most famous film adaptation of it, which stars Humphrey Bogart. And it's a very taut and interesting novel. But he goes to describe Hammett, and he says, Hammett wrote it first and almost to the end for people with a sharp, aggressive attitude to life. They were not afraid of the seamy side of things. They lived there. Violence did not dismay them. It was right down their street. Hammett gave murder back to the kind of people that commit it for reasons. Not just to provide a corpse and with the means at hand. Not hand-wrought dueling pistols, curare, and tropical fish. He put these people down on paper as they were, and he made them talk and think in the language they customarily used for these purposes. He had style, but his audience didn't know it because it was in a language not supposed to be capable of such refinements. And he notes this, that Hammett really has sort of returned detective fiction and crime fiction to the streets, and taken it out of the manors or out of the drawing rooms or out of the cruise ships and put it back in the streets, in the apartments, in the clapboard house. He has populated crime fiction with people who are desperate. They are desperate humans, desperate characters, and that becomes a vein of fiction that other writers will explore in different ways, and that's what I'd like to talk about at the end of this. But Chandler notes towards the end, he has a couple of very powerful paragraphs that have sort of become, I think, bywords in a sense for Chandler's style. And he notes that within the Maltese Falcon, of course, the one crucial murder at the beginning of the story, nobody really becomes concerned with because they're wrapped up in that world, and that the crime, the purpose of the crime, is not necessarily the purpose of the story. Chandler writes, "It is not a fragrant world, but it is the world you live in, and certain writers with tough minds and a cool spirit of detachment can make very interesting and even amusing patterns out of it. It is not funny that a man should be killed, but it is sometimes funny that he should be killed for so little, and that his death should be the coin of what we call civilization. All this still is not quite enough. In everything that can be called art, there is a quality of redemption. It may be pure tragedy, if it is high tragedy, and it may be pity and irony, and it may be the raucous laughter of the strong man. But down these mean streets a man must go who is not himself mean, who is neither tarnished nor afraid. The detective in this kind of story must be such a man. He is the hero, he is everything. He must be a complete man and a common man and yet an unusual man. He must be, to use a rather weathered phrase, a man of honor, by instinct, by inevitability, without thought of it, and certainly without saying it. He must be the best man in his world and a good enough man for any world." And he goes on to give more qualities. And this is, of course, a very chauvinistic description of who this detective should be. And there are great writers who have pushed against that. And there are assumptions that Chandler has about other characteristics of this man. But there's something to what he's getting at there, that it is not necessarily, as he describes the plot of one famous story that many of us have read and loved, where it's all about trying to put the little gray cells together and solve the little puzzle, but rather to experience something about a world that feels very close to our own, perhaps a little grimier, perhaps a little more dangerous, but a world that feels very close and recognizable, I think, to many readers. And that was what Chandler was championing. I won't read how derisive he is towards the Murder on the Orient Express, but he has his choices. So, of course, one of the writers that Chandler had championed was Dashiell Hammett, and he notes the Maltese Falcon, but I think Hammett's earlier works in the Continental Op reveal that same side. Red Harvest, I think, has those plot holes. It doesn't quite make perfect sense. In The Glass Key, he has a book that's equally just an absolute masterpiece, but also is perhaps a little too powerful, a little too removed from the streets, as Ned Beaumont has a bit more power certainly than any of us would have. But he contrasts that, Chandler contrasts that with writers like the Poirot stories of Agatha Christie. And he's particularly, he notes Murder on the Orient Express, where he goes, well, you put it all together, but it can feel a little too contrived. And that, I think, is one of the dangers of detective fiction. When it's not perfectly tight and perfectly fascinating, it can feel contrived. On the other hand, you do get masterful stories like The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie, which is an all-time favorite. If you've never read that one, I won't say anything about it. Please don't read anything about it. Just go read the book. It's fantastic. And many of these trace their roots to the great Sherlock Holmes stories of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, which Chandler doesn't mention, but that's sort of there in the background of, is this detective so much smarter than everybody? Does that make it an interesting book versus a detective who's sort of a survivor, a detective who weathers the challenges and is not smarter than all of us, but is able to persevere and be resilient. Chandler, of course, is famous for his own Philip Marlowe series, The Big Sleep being the first. Not my favorite, but an excellent book, I think, and one where he tries to display that. There are plot holes in The Big Sleep, but reading The Big Sleep is not about figuring out the plot and who killed so-and-so or where someone disappeared to. It's really about this experience and this journey for the characters. Later on, we would have writers like Ross MacDonald who introduced some really explicit psychology to the detective novel. And two writers I want to note as sort of a contrast to these who took these types of books and stories in different directions. One is the great Dorothy Hughes, I would say particularly with In a Lonely Place. This is maybe one of the single best crime novels I've ever read in my life. And that's because it turns many of Chandler's assumptions on their head, not about the characteristics of the person who's solving this crime and fighting back against the evil in the city, but because it's a woman who has to do all of this. And that this book really, displays the power of not just a thinking woman, but a woman of action, a woman who's able to counterplot and counteract a killer in fascinating and brilliant detail. So it's very different, I would note, as well, from the Humphrey Bogart adaptation, if you've ever seen that. I would really, really encourage folks to try this one out. Another assumption, I think, is that these detectives are sort of on the edge of the law of society. They're outlaw they're sort of outlaw in the sense of they're outside the law. They're going to push envelopes, make choices that aren't strictly legal. And there's an unspoken assumption that character has to be white. Writers like Chester Himes in his brilliant Harlem novels push against that narrative. Certainly Walter Mosley with the great Easy Rawlins books pushes against that narrative as well and introduces other qualities that this hero could have. But the detective novel continued to change in interesting ways. Sort of the most reductive version of it is, I think, the Mickey Spillane books. These can feel like compulsive to read, but they are also incredibly violent, incredibly misogynistic, displaying the worst attitudes of that seamy side of life, and of a society that has this as its seamy side of life. These can feel incredibly, compelling and urgent books, and they can also feel incredibly degrading books. But the detective novel continues to change. In the later 60s, you get someone like Bill Pronzini, where his nameless detective doesn't have a name, is strictly just sort of getting through the hurdle, getting over the hurdles, pushing forward, trying to figure things out, and lacks qualities of personality that I think we would want to appreciate, and clearly is not smarter than all of us, is simply just going to keep working until it's figured out. A very, very different approach is taken by Arthur Lyons in his detective, his Jacob Ash books, where it's almost the paperwork, like the insurance style, tracing paperwork and documentation that comes to hand. And these can be really, really good books because they display this world of the late 60s, early 1970s, and the danger that is now added on, and it's different. It's an enhanced danger from what was happening in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. But there's this different sense of, it's not somebody who's just going to punch people to get the answer. It's somebody who's going to a hall of records and tracing documents and tracing that to solve a crime. Another writer who I think continued pushing in that direction would be Elmore Leonard. There's certainly a sense of sarcasm and irony that underlies much of his writing that feels increasingly modern, increasingly dark in some ways. And then that explodes in the 1970s with books that I think really come out of the disappointment and disgrace of Watergate, of Vietnam, and writers like Newton Thornburg with Cutter and Bone, or James Crumley with The Wrong Case or The Last Good Kiss, introducing his detectives. These books are not necessarily read for the plot at all. Like Cutter and Bone is an actually terrifying book to read. This, even now, feels incredibly realistic and close to the world that many of us live in the U.S., with who is able to commit crimes and what happens when someone tries to hold them accountable. Crumley's world is incredibly jaundiced. The plot literally doesn't make sense. It makes less sense than The Big Sleep, but it's about this sensibility that the writer is trying to project. Someone like Ross Thomas, I think, did that, hewing a little closer to the plots. And certainly in the 1980s, 1990s, a writer like James Ellroy did it, using more of the police procedural style, but he took those ideas from Hammett and Chandler and wrapped them into some interesting ways. And we continue to see that in writers who produce books that feel like that they have elements of detective fiction without being explicitly detective fiction. Something like The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon or The Broom of the System by David Foster Wallace. These are books that have mysteries at their heart, missing people at their heart, conspiracies at their heart, and someone trying to unravel it who has no training, who is not equipped to unravel this mystery, but has a chance to perhaps get close to unraveling it, closer than anyone else. And the fact that the characters who can do that in both novels are women is, I think, interesting. Pynchon in Inherent Vice gives a much more explicit detective book, and it looks like his next book will, where this is a main character who's a detective, but the book itself, is it really a detective story, or is it a portrait of a specific time and place in the 1960s in California? And the last one I'll mention is a series of police procedurals, but I think they get at what Chandler was writing about the realism, about the fact that it's not about deducing and putting together all of these puzzles. It's about, as Arthur Lyons was doing, tracing documentation, persevering, not being willing to give up. And even when, the Martin Beck is sick as a dog throughout various books, or just miserable in general. And those would be the Martin Beck novels by Sio Wallu, the husband and wife team who gave us a portrait for a decade of Sweden, but also wrote some of the absolute best detective fiction, even if it's in the police procedural vein, not the private detective vein. So let me know what you think of any of these. Let me know if you hate Chandler or if you love him. I did read a couple of books in Private Eye July, and hopefully I'm going to get the videos out this week. But let me know what you think. I've long used The Simple Art of Murder as sort of a rubric. Now, I don't agree with everything in it, but I think he has some valid points. So hope everyone's doing well. Thank you.